Good evening and welcome to the regular meeting of the Board of Education for December 18th, 2023. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
I would love to take the roll. Mrs. Acosta.
Here.
Mrs. Bradford is not with us this evening. Mrs. Burton.
Here.
Mrs. Frank.
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Here.
Mrs. Bonnefield is here. President Johnson.
Here. We do have a quorum. And Mrs. Acosta, would you lead us in the pledge tonight?
Yes. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening once again, and as Mrs. Bonnefield said, Mrs. Bradford is not with us tonight. She's a little under the weather, but if you're watching, Karen, we miss you. Get well soon, and hopefully we'll see you as soon as possible. Again, welcome. This is the regular meeting of the Board of Education for December 18th, 2023. Anyone who is in the audience who wants to follow along with our agenda, you can go out the left door and turn to your right, and we have agendas out there along with our blue slips for anyone who wants to address the board. For those of you watching at home who want to follow along with our agenda, you can do so by going to our website, which is livoniapublicschools.org. You could highlight over the board tab, and when you go down to board information, you will be able to see the agendas and you can follow along with us. Given that this is a regular meeting, the items that are coming before the board tonight have been presented to the board on at least two occasions previously to this. One at our study session, where the items are given to us basically on a notice basis, and then at a committee of the whole meeting, which was last week, which is also televised. That's where we really get into the nitty-gritty, and there's where we ask questions and iron out any differences or questions we may have with those items. So if you really want to see the discussion on the items, you can either go to our committee of the whole or attend our study sessions in person. One of the things that we always talk about is our community with character, and we always look at respect. And it's interesting because we've talked about respect a lot, but I went today and I just looked at a definition, and we always say, well, we may not always agree with one another, but we respect each other's positions, and that's exactly what one of them says. It says valuing their feelings and their views even if you don't necessarily agree with them. And that's what we do here. We might not always agree with one another, but we do listen to each other and take each other's points of view seriously. And a lot of times we change our opinion because of that. That's what respect is. We will respect anyone who comes before the board. We would expect anyone who comes before the board will respect us and the cabinet and our superintendent. As I said, that's the best way we can teach our children how to act in a civilized society. With that, we're going to move on to item 3, our communications. And item A is our district update from our superintendent. So I'll turn it over to Mrs. Oquist.
Well, thank you so much, President Johnson. We're excited to share a number of highlights with you this evening, and so we will go ahead and get started with the district update. Without further ado, here we go. So we always like to share some, just a few of the hundreds and hundreds of examples of learning and growing that take place across our district each and every day. Here we have some of our kindergarten friends in Mrs. Mitchell's class at Randolph. And we know that they are always busy learning. They're also learning to share and growing together. It's a great picture of sharing right there, isn't it? As we move on, we hop over to the upper elementary level. You see Mr. Johnson's class here. They're working on decimal placement in mathematics. I'm sure some of you remember those days. That is often one of those challenging milestones in math, but feeling great accomplishment as they learn it. And our Project Lead the Way classes are just growing abounds throughout the district. As you know, we've gone full scale with a K-12 Project Lead the Way STEM pathway, and you have some of our kiddos here at Roosevelt using the 3D printer, and they really are focusing on really using those life skills of teamwork and communications as they work in groups throughout each of the projects. We have some students here jumping up to the high school level in one of our physics classes at Churchill. They were looking at the ways to calculate the force of a moving object. And we have our Cooper Coyotes. You may recall the fun of sitting in the author's chair. And so we have some of our kiddos here in Mrs. Yost's class showing off their amazing writing skills, sitting in the author's chair and sharing their writing with a very attentive class. And here we have some of our young adults from Garfield Community School. We know that they work hard in each of their classes. They truly enjoy their culinary class. And if you follow them on social media at all or have the good fortune to be able to spend time there, you will see some amazing creations taking place in our classes there at Garfield Community School. Next, we have some other students from Riley Upper Elementary. They are also working on important life and communication skills of speaking and listening. So we started off looking at some kindergarten friends learning to do that, and we are still working on that as we go up through the grades. We have Mrs. Cronin's class here working on their ELA together. And last week or the week prior, our LCTC students in the graphic design and fashion merchandising had a wonderful opportunity to go down to CCS, the College for Creative Studies, and take a look at all of the different programs they have to offer. We normally have some of our students who will move on to CCS for their programming after high school. So a great opportunity to really get a firsthand look. From there, they went to the Parade Company, and that is an amazing trip if you have had the opportunity to go. And they learned about making the floats really from the initial concept all the way through to completion. So quite a day for our students there from the Career Center. And here we have some of our kiddos from Mrs. Connor's art room at Nijiiro. Aren't those cool lava lamps? Mm-hmm. They created using different kinds of shapes and using their creativity to create these lava lamps that fill the hallways at Nijiiro. And here are students from Mrs. Fahili's Law and Justice class at Stevenson. Last 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, they held mock trials. And a few of us had the good fortune of being able to attend and listen to some of the opening statements of the attorneys, to watch the attorneys question the witnesses, and to have the jury looking through pieces of evidence that were explained by the attorneys. And then they came up and the opposing attorney did cross-examinations of witnesses. It was really amazing work. A tremendous amount of preparation went into this by the students and by their teacher. So it was quite a wonderful opportunity to see our students really engage in a very lifelike process. So they have a case, they work that through, they do a tremendous amount of prep and have depositions, etc., as they go through this process. So it was very impressive. Today, at the elementary level, if you have an elementary kiddo in the district, then you know that our students were home today because we had our elementary district team. So we had teachers from across the district learning together. So if you were, for instance, a second grade teacher, you were meeting for half of the day with the entire second grade team from every school across our district. And those sessions were led by members of our academic services department, by our CALs or our content area leaders, or our literacy coaches or instructional coaches. That it also included our groups of speech pathologists, school social workers, library media specialists, PE teachers. So each of those groups met with their peer group as it relates to their role. And so there is time in the day for building-based or school-based professional development, but also one of the things that really was that really grew in in building the process of district teams was during COVID, when we brought together teams of teachers from the same grade level, the same content area, to really look at a comprehensive, cohesive set of instructional standards. And to be able to have that opportunity to collaborate and communicate together about the progress of their students, what's working. And so that was just an amazing opportunity today to do that. So while we know that that can always be tough for our families to have that time when our kiddos are out of school, it really is powerful time for our staff. And so that was going on throughout the day today, including in this room. Then we had learning for adults, our leaders as well. So a couple weeks ago, we had our district administrative leadership team. As you know, we meet regularly with them for their own growth and development as leaders. We held this last one at LCTC. So many of them were in there for the first time since the renovation. And so they got to see the Career Center renovations as well as the new Robotics Center. And then we did our own work with them for a couple of hours at the end of the day. And so it was very powerful learning together, but they were also absolutely wowed. And it's just not often that they have the opportunity to be in one another's schools that way and to get that kind of tour. So that was an exciting day for us. As you know, we also continue to work on our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging team. And this is the new mosaic, and as we've shared in the link a few weeks ago, that is the Livonia Public Schools DEIB model that we utilize to really symbolize the coming together of our staff, of our students, and our families, all working toward that important sense of belonging. So we had more than 50 LPS staff working together, and we will continue that important work throughout the year, as well as each of our PTAs that are encouraged to have a DEIB chair who are doing some wonderful things in the schools as well. I will say, well, the one thing I'll mention, because I know our board talked about it a little bit last year, that idea of belonging and the importance of that each of our students, that what we want to build for them is a sense of connection to their school. And whether that's in an activity, whether that's with a trusted adult at the school, in some way that they feel like they belong, and the importance of that. And I have to say, as we went around and people shared, because we had a number of new faces in the group this year. Thank you, Mrs. Acosta, for joining us as well. We loved having you there. And I think you would agree that a lot of what we heard was that idea of looking for belonging and enhancing that for our students was a lot of what drew people into this discussion and this work. So it was terrific. Here we had our Franklin students who had the opportunity to talk with a number of local businesses. They had a trades awareness fair, and so many times we'll hear folks in the community talk about the importance of our students knowing what their options are. So it was great that Franklin held this trades awareness fair, and that a number of local businesses were able to come and talk to our students about their opportunities that they may have after graduation. And what can be more fun this time of year than all of the wonderful things that come with celebrating the holidays? So here we have some of our cuties from Roosevelt building gingerbread houses. Do you just remember how that smells? I remember that from a principal and a teacher just going through a cafeteria full of frosting and graham crackers. So you just can't quite forget that. And here's at Cleveland. We have Dr. Owens here with a number of our kiddos in the photo booth. So this was the first time in several years that the Cleveland PTA held, I believe it was Cleveland was telling me this was the first time in a number of years, held the Secret Santa shop. And it was just so well attended, they had to continue to go out and buy more and more to fill up the tables. But after that, they got a chance to go into a holiday-themed photo booth and take pictures. So lots of great fun happening out there. Here we have some of our Randolph kiddos and parents and families at the Jolly Jamboree. It looks like Santa had time to stop by, as you can imagine how busy he is. And there he was at Randolph. And we had our Rosedale kiddos celebrating the end of the first trimester. As you know, the elementary wrapped up the trimester, and report cards will be going available to parents this week. But they had a movie and a holiday dance party. I would call that a good day. Stevenson DECA, who many of you had a chance to meet when we went to their DECA Day, they were able to visit LCA and really take a look at the conference center and the arena, and had an opportunity to talk with some of the top business professionals in the Pistons organization and get a tour, and then they got to stay for the game. So some really creative opportunities. This is the time of year for joyful music, and here we have some pictures of the Stevenson High School Band and Orchestra Holiday Concert. They were joined by over 70 alumni who joined the band. I believe your son was one of them, right?
Yep.
And what a wonderful opportunity there. Here we have our Frost Symphonic Band and Concert Band and the Churchill Jazz Band performed together as well. And just be sure, we have I believe we have a group tomorrow night at Franklin. I believe it's Emerson and Franklin together performing. And then Thursday night, I believe it's Stevenson Choir or band or orchestra. We have Stevenson Music happening on Thursday. So if you are interested, be sure to check out the district website or the school website, but both Franklin and Stevenson have concerts still this week. And speaking of Stevenson Choir, we had the joy of hearing the symphonic choir last week at the noon Rotary Club. They were our entertainment, and they were absolutely spectacular. A number of us were able to be there and enjoy hearing from them, and got to meet with them afterward. As you know, they work so hard at their craft, whether it's the instrument is their voice or a physical instrument. Their work is tremendous, and the output is beautiful. I know a number of us were able to attend last week's Garfield Community Schools, the Holiday Craft Show. So as you see here, just a few of the treasures created in partnership between our wonderful staff at the Garfield Community School and our students. And so our students were an active part of creating these treasures. I see a few here up on the table. And they were also involved with selling them and bagging them. There were baked goods and raffle baskets, and boy, did the community come out. Lots of alumni, families, staff members from across the district. It was just a wonderful event. So thank you to everyone in the community who came by. We went maybe early afternoon, and they were sold out of quite a bit, and they were pretty happy about that and feeling very proud. We had our members of our Franklin baseball and softball teams dropped off toys and other goodies to their triad friends at Cooper for families in that school community, which was wonderful. And more holiday giving at Churchill. As you know, they are just known for their annual canned food drive, and they absolutely crushed their goal by over 7,000 cans of food above and beyond their goal. So I'm so proud of them in the work that they do. That is a huge event at Churchill and has been for several years. And Stevenson, as you know, each year has been hosting Fleece and Thank You. The blankets that they make go to children who are in local hospitals around Metro Detroit. And so you can either donate to contribute toward a blanket, or you can actually attend and make one of the cut and tie blankets. And so they were able to make over 140 blankets to send out to some little sweeties who are in the hospital this holiday season. And you are also able to send a message along with your blanket to be received by the person who is getting your blanket, which is so special. I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but Wreaths Across America is a nationwide effort to have wreaths be placed at the grave of each deceased service member. And it is a huge undertaking. And this year, Stevenson's NHS and the SAD group both participated in that process. And the motto of Wreaths Across America is Remember, Honor, Teach. And last year, there were over 2.7 million wreaths laid at the graves of service members. And I just love that two of our school groups took part in this. They were over at Riverside Cemetery and they took part in placing wreaths at the grave sites. And there are 5,000 community groups across the nation that take time to do this and contribute toward this effort. So it's called Wreaths Across America. And I don't know, aren't you impressed with our kids?
Yes.
My goodness, just all the way across the board, whether it's the can drive, fleece and thank you, things like this. I mean, it's just one right, and also within their own community, just they continue to make a difference from their hearts to to the world around them, and we are so appreciative of that. And we know that there are lots of adults who, in our staff and in our homes across the community, that are part of making that happen. So, thank you. So winter sports is definitely underway. You see some of our Lady Patriots here and our Lady Spartans, and they are off to a great start this for basketball. And we have our Garfield basketball team here. They played Joe Brighton Skill Center in Wyandotte, and you see some happy athletes and coaches in this picture. And we also have wrestling and Churchill swim, or all of our swim and dive, and obviously boys wrestling, and we have, did I catch them all? Hockey, baseball, bowling, swimming, and wrestling are all underway right now. So we, as you know, we have our new Stallions. They are a combined unified team from Franklin and Churchill. Those are their neat new uniforms. And we have our Spartans here as well. So just some congratulations before we wrap up. Hayes has long been involved in green efforts across the school, and Mrs. Lakatos, the art teacher, is a big part of those efforts. And so we have a very dedicated group of students at Hayes, and they're called Leader of the Pack, and they won the Detroit Zoo Green Prize Merit Award for having a waste-free lunch campaign. So they'll receive a $500 prize and a celebration at the zoo in April. They have done some tremendous work is in being a green school, and their efforts have just been continuous for many years now. So congratulations to the leaders of the pack. And we have some of our Cleveland students here who are being recognized for being responsible. President Johnson, you often start talking about our community with character. So this is still an important part, and it continues to be and has been for many years, our character traits. And so oftentimes they're a different focus each month, and this past month was responsibility at Cleveland. And so we have a number of kiddos here who were recognized. And our middle school robotics have been off to a very strong start. We had, we want to congratulate the Holmes RoboHawks and the Frost White Robo Falcons and the Frost Black Robo Falcons. They all qualified to compete at the state level. They competed last weekend and the weekend prior at 2 different state events. And also the Buchanan Robo Bears, one of our elementary teams, competed as well. So they are off to a tremendous start. This is this has been their busy season, and pretty soon we will go into the build season and competition season for our Tyros and our Warriors at the high school level. So congratulations to all of our students who have been so dedicated in their efforts, along with our mentors, volunteers, and coaches. Webster won a truckload of books. So we had Mrs. Cleveland's class at Webster. One of the construction workers from a local construction company came to Mrs. Cleveland's class and read a book and delivered a toy truck and a stack of construction books, coloring books, and goodie bags. So there were some very excited kiddos there to receive those gifts. And we had a number of classroom makeover winners sponsored by Shepherd Insurance Agency and MEMIC in Livonia. So these were $300 classroom makeover grants awarded to Macy Reese at Churchill, Megan Seuss at Frost, Elizabeth Gostomsky at Kennedy, and Chelsea Wilk at Jackson, who were each recipients of this award. And I want to thank Mrs. Jenkins and Ms. Thompson for their coordination of this effort. And, here we go. I did not even have to guess. Here it is, right here. Franklin and Emerson, featuring the Franklin and Emerson bands, will be tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in the Franklin PAC. Remember, just a reminder to check your e-backpack mail. That's really where we send all of our information to our families, and you can click on it for activities happening around the community. This is instead of flyers going home in your backpack and having to dig through for those, there is an e-backpack mail link, and that is kept up regularly on our site. Mark your calendars for the chili cook-off, January 20th. I know, I think just about all of our board likes to attend and do some tasting. And we have lots of PTAs participating in the cooking. So it's always a great event. That will be held at Franklin on January 20th, and it's certain to be a snowy Saturday. For some reason,
It always is.
It always is. So again, from our LPS family to yours, we wish you a very, very happy and blessed holiday season and a safe and restful break. Thank you, President Johnson. Just a reminder, we didn't have one last month, so this one was a little long.
I'm still putting in the date for the chili cook-off.
Okay.
Okay, now we're set. Thank you, Mrs. Oquist.
You're so welcome.
It's amazing how many things go on in our schools that many, many people don't see. And it's great to have that update and show them all the wonderful things that are going on. Kudos to our students. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 3B, written communications. I don't believe there are any written communications. We'll move to response to prior audience communication. Once again, I don't believe there are any. That takes us to item 3D, audience communications. I do not have any blue slips. None? All right. That'll take us into item 4, our consent agenda. And may I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the following consent agenda items as recommended by the superintendent. 5A, minutes of the regular meeting of November 20th, 2023.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonifield. Are there any, I guess there's only one item. Does anyone want that item removed? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonifield, to approve the consent agenda. And Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
President Johnson.
Yes, the motion carries. Thank you. That'll take us now to item 6, our business matters. And item A is approval of sale of property on Ann Arbor Trail. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Acosta.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve delegating to the superintendent or her designee the authority to enter into an offer to purchase real estate, execute said offer, as well as any and all documents necessary and incidental to the sale, including any timing extensions required and all closing documents with Leo Sauve Building Incorporated, whereby Leo Sauve Building Incorporated has offered to purchase 10.33 plus or minus acres of vacant land located on the south side of Ann Arbor Trail, west of North Merriman Road, Westland, Michigan, Sidwell number 56-012-99-0017-001 for a total of $470,000.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, and we'll hear from Mr. Francis. Good evening.
Good evening, President Johnson. Pardon me. As discussed at the study session and the committee of the whole, this is a piece of property, again, as mentioned in the recommendation, on Ann Arbor Trail. It is a wooded area with some wetlands. It does not have and has not had any of the district's school buildings on it, nor any other structure on it. It's not a piece of property that the district has any intention of using or having for future use because of the site itself and how it is configured with regard to the wetland area. Just giving a quick update maybe a little bit more than I usually do during a voting session here on a resolution, just because it's a unique item. We're selling a piece of property, but just for the community who might be tuning in for the first time, again, this isn't a property that had or would have a school building on it or any other facility that the district would use. We were approached by the developer asking if we'd be willing to sell it after discussion with the board, and the board being supportive of that, we then interacted with the representatives of the developer. We have come to an agreement on a purchase agreement, and what the board is actually voting on this evening is to authorize the superintendent or her designee to go ahead and fulfill all of the signing of those documents that would be coming forward as we go through closing of this property. The dollars that would be brought in to the district would be going into the capital funds budget.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton?
Yes, I'm definitely supportive of the sale of this piece of property. As Mr. Francis said, it has not been used for any of our school facilities, nor do we ever foresee using this. Matter of fact, in our conversations in the committee of the whole, this property, we talked about how long have we had this property. It goes back as far as anybody can remember, but it never has been utilized for building any kind of structure. If we were to need to build another school in the future, so far that we can't foresee the situation, but we are unlikely to build it at the very southern part of the district. It would much more likely be a central location that we would look to build any facility that we would need. And the fact that this is not all, even the property itself is not all buildable, because there's some wetlands that prohibit that. So seeing as we will not, in the foreseeable future, need to use this for a property, for a school facility, one of our responsibilities as board members is to either acquire or sell land. And I've said for a while, we're not a real estate holding company. If there's land that we do not foresee ever needing to use for school purposes, I would much rather sell that land and put the value of that into serving the needs of our students today and in the immediate future. So I'm definitely in favor of selling this piece of property.
Thank you, Ms. Burton. Other questions or comments? I have a couple. Mr. Francis, in looking at the purchase offer, there are some contingencies in there, primarily the governmental approvals for zoning, correct?
Correct. That's one of the items, when verbally discussing the offer with the developer, that was one item that, not of concern, but just simply for timing's sake. Generally, we have much shorter timelines because of the due diligence period. It's a different type of due diligence period because of the wetlands that exist. So really, the one contingency that the developer was requesting was simply time to have all of those approvals taken care of, and that was something that we were certainly willing to work with them on. Our attorney, district's legal counsel, is the one that drafted this purchase agreement. That was the one item that the developer, the purchaser, had asked for. We discussed it internally, and we were supportive of making that one change. Beyond that, there isn't a whole heck of a lot in there beyond those timelines with the city of Westland's approval of their site plan. Because I think there's some nuances with regard to that wetland and what real due diligence of how much is buildable and how much is not, so that they can get that site plan put together appropriately for the city.
And I will note that that's not an unusual clause to have in a purchase offer. So the other question I have is, looking at the extension periods, I mean, this gives them really, by my calculation, 150 or 350 days. And I guess this one is for Mrs. Smith. The proceeds for this sale Are those included in our budget amendments?
We, in this most recent budget amendment that the board is voting on tonight, included it, but knowing that we do not have immediate plans to spend these funds, and we do have another formal budget amendment coming in June, so if the close doesn't happen by June, then we have an opportunity to take that sale back out of our budget.
Okay, and I know it's not going into the general fund, but it is under the capital projects. Right?
Correct.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that if it goes this year, then it'll be included. If the delay goes beyond June 30th, then it'll be in next year's.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Mrs. Bird?
For the benefit of those who may not be aware, when we're talking about the Capital Projects Fund, by board policy, any sale of property has to go into the Capital Projects Fund, because we recognize that this is one-time revenue coming into the district, and therefore we can only spend it on one-time expenditures, as opposed to salaries or something along that line that would be going on year after year. So unless that policy reads that unless the district is below the MSBO fund balance of 15 to 20%, and even that was only recently added in the last handful of years, going through the recession. But other than that, any sale of property has got to be put in the capital projects fund, and that is strictly used for other capital purchases, property or large equipment purchases.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to approve the sale of property on Ann Arbor Trail. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, the motion carries. That takes us now to item 6B, approval of 2024 contractors rebid 2021 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Jarvis?
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation from its owner's representative, Plant Moran Real Point, and its construction manager, Clark Construction Company, to approve the contractors identified and the construction project budgets for rebids of the Phase 3 bid package number 2 for 2024 renovations at Hayes Elementary, Hoover Elementary, Roosevelt Elementary, Holmes Middle School, Stevenson High School, including pool room, Franklin Pool Room, and Churchill Pool Room.
By Mrs. Acosta. And once again, we'll hear from Mr. Francis.
Thank you very much. One of the things I'd like to bring up with the board, we didn't have this opportunity during the committee of the whole to walk through just some very quick information regarding the combination of the original bid for the summer of '24, those contractors, and this, the handful of items that were the rebids for the summer of '24. When we came to the board last week, we did talk about how this round was about $66,000 over our estimated budget for those handful of contractors. But when putting this package together, the vast majority of contractors were actually, bids were accepted and the board had approved the month previous. So in total, for the 5 buildings being renovated along with the high school pool rooms, we're at this point going into this summer at $100,000 and some change under budget, under our original budget for the summer of '24. So if somebody had tuned in last week, apologies for not doing a very good job of tie-barring those 2 bids together and explaining that overall, we are actually 6 figures to the good in the summer of 2024. So beyond that, these are, as I've mentioned, for the summer of 2024, there were a handful of items such as concrete, electrical, mechanical, that we put back on the street to get better coverage, and we were actually overall very pleased with the contractors that we got in the rebids. We are now ready to go with our contractors, going to have contracts set up, all the due diligence afterwards to be ready to go in the summer of 2024 for that 2021 bond initiative renovations in those spaces.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Any questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
As a reminder that I mentioned in the committee of the whole, because my family's company bid to one of the contractors that is listed on this document, I will be abstaining from this vote.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Acosta, to approve the 2024 contractors' rebids for the 2021 bond. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Benefield says yes, and President Johnson.
Yes. The motion passes. Thank you. That takes us to item 6C, approval of purchase for bookshelves for LMC 2021 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Frank.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation from the owner's representative, Plant Moran Real Point, to approve the purchase of bookshelves for library media centers at Hoover Elementary, Hayes Elementary, Roosevelt Elementary, Holmes Middle School, and Stevenson High School from NBS Commercial Interiors, Troy, Michigan, in an amount not to exceed $377,000, which includes contingency.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Burton. And once again, Mr. Francis.
Thank you very much, President Johnson. We have bookshelves that are essentially considered furniture because they are freestanding items, or some do get connected to the wall. But we have, over the past couple of years, brought this to the board prior to the full furniture package because of lead times on these. So we have pulled out, once again, just the bookshelves for the 5 LMCs that are being renovated this coming summer in 2024. And we have all the detail in last week's packet as well as today's on the different pricing and purchasing contracts that they come from, as well as the details and layouts. One thing I want to address with the board, we had 2 items I'd like to just simply point out, and this was not known last week when we were with you, was that there was accidentally, by the designer, had Hoover and Holmes dollar amounts transposed. So Hoover had a higher number than Holmes, which, when you think about it, doesn't quite make sense. So that got fixed up, and we were able to get those squared away in today's meetings packet. So the quotes that you see and the numbers that you see in the recommendation letters are correct now.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Francis.
You're welcome.
Questions or comments? Mrs. Bonnefield.
Mr. Francis, just to make sure, there's no change in dollar value as to what we discussed last week. It's simply a transposition of schools, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. Mrs. Frank.
I just wanted to say that this is really exciting upgrades. I mean, we've seen these, we've looked at these before, but especially with our elementary kids, they spend so much time in the libraries and the media centers, and they go in there, and I know many of us have been volunteers in the libraries, and they needed some upgrade. And these kids, we want them still, they have such great access to computers and that sort of thing, but we still want to teach them to love books. And so I think the way that we're doing the bookcases and the colors in the libraries and just different things are going to be so innovative that the kids are really going to be able to enjoy their time in that space. And so I'm loving that we're investing in these so that it can be a welcoming space for these kids. So thanks for your staff and your team that are looking at these, and just the pictures of bookshelves are really great to add a little bit of color and pop to the school. So thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Others? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Burton, to approve the purchase of bookshelves for LMC 2021 bond. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
Mrs. Benefield says yes, President Johnson.
Yes, the motion carries. Thank you. That takes us now to items 6D, approval of purchase of high school pool scoreboards 2021 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase and installation of pool room scoreboards at Churchill High School, Franklin High School, and Stevenson High School from Dektronics Brookings, South Dakota, in the amount of $311,718, plus installation from AJ Signs and Installation, Chesterfield, Michigan, in the amount of $14,400, plus a contingency in the amount of $8,000 for a total cost of $334,118.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. And once again, Mr. Francis.
Thank you very much. For those who were following along with the committee of the whole last week, I had mentioned then, and I'll repeat again today, that these are just the scoreboards for the 3 pools. And the timing systems, which is really the brains of the outfit when it comes to swim meets, is still in the package that will be coming, that is being done via the bond for the summers. So we had pulled this out to get them sooner because the one at Stevenson was failing. And the conversation that the bond team had was, let's just get all 3 scoreboards purchased, up on the wall and running for the teams. It will not impede any of the work that will be done as we go into those pool rooms to do the different updating at different spaces within there. So that's what we have in front of us, are those 3 scoreboards, and this would be purchased from the 2021 bond.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Any questions or comments? Mrs. Bonnefield.
Mr. Francis, I know we talked about it a little bit last week, but just to reassure everybody that even though a lot of this stuff is being done in the same summer, that still the timing for the pools is going to allow for all of our sports and all of the student opportunities to remain because of the timing.
We've been in conversation over and over again with the principals and the athletic administrators in those schools. We will be doing this in phases so that all 3 pools would not be shut down at a single time. They would be phased out. It might be conceivable that one swim team might have to practice or do some works at another high school. We've done that in the past when we've done tennis courts and other types of work as such, but we are, yes, purposely working with them on timing and spreading out so that we do not take down all 3 at one time during the season. They may all be getting some work done if it's, if we're in the middle of summer, but we're working with them to make sure that we have pools available for the students.
All of our students, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. Other questions or comments? I may be a bit confused. Are we doing the scoreboards at the same time as we're doing the other work on the pools, or are these going in first?
These are going in first. They won't inhibit or get in the way of any of the work being done. And because of the failure, that's near failure of the Stevenson board, we decided, why just do Stevenson's board now? Let's just put all 3 up. So we're putting them up when we get them and when AJ Signs comes and installs them.
Do we have any idea what that timeline looks like?
We've been fairly, I don't want to say lucky, but fortunate with the boards. Once we have the lead time of the board themselves, installation is pretty quickly right behind it. And this one's a little bit easier because we're not out in a field running electrical across the grass and whatnot. So I don't have an exact timing on them. We're waiting on the boards first, and then AJ's usually right behind that with the installation. So we're thinking it's going to be more like the springish.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Or late winter, however that plays out.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing that, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to approve the purchase of high school pool scoreboards 2021 bond. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 6E, approval of mobile vertical lift purchase 2021 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Burton.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of 8 Ballymore mobile vertical lifts from Granger, Lake Forest, Illinois, for a total cost of $91,340.04.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield. And once again, Mr. Francis,
Thank you again.
this will be an uplifting discussion.
How long you been carrying that one?
I've worked on that all day.
Pretty good, pretty good. So these are 8 lifts for our maintenance crews to be able to use and reach in areas such as, the high ceilings, changing bulbs, working on electrical items, changing ceiling pad tiles, et cetera. The current lifts we have, and we currently have 10 of them, are 30-plus years old. They've done very well for us, served us well over the past few decades. We'll be putting those out to get whatever value they may have at auction. And these 8 mobile lifts will be replacing those 10. And for anybody trying to figure out the math on that, 30 years ago, we had more buildings and more facilities than we do today. So we thought it was prudent just to bring it down. We'll be putting one of these each in each of our secondary buildings, middle and high schools. And then that'll leave us a couple more to be able to have them rover around to other spaces on an as-needed basis. This is actually being paid for from the 2021 bond initiative. In that original bond initiative, we did have, just like we did in the 2013 bond initiative, a line item and a budgetary area for maintenance equipment, and this would fall under maintenance equipment.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, to approve the purchase of mobile vertical lifts, 2021 bond. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
President Johnson.
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 6F, approval of 2023-2024 budget amendment. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Acosta.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools approve the attached amended budgets for the 2023-2024 school year. General Fund, Funded Projects Fund, Special Education Fund, Debt Retirement Fund, 2021 Bond Fund, 2023 Bond Fund, Sinking Fund, Capital Projects Fund, Food Services Fund, Health and Welfare Fund, Scholarship Fund, and School Activities Fund.
Support.
Stereo. We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, and we're going to hear from Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, President Johnson, and thank you to the entire board for the ample time that you provided for me to walk through the budget book with you, both at our study session, at the Committee of the Whole meeting last week. We had the opportunity to look at each one of these funds mentioned in the motion. To summarize, I'll focus on our general fund, which is obviously our largest one. And as you know, and as we discussed at the Committee of the Whole and study session, our proposed budget for the school year was adopted back in June, and that was before the state had established the state aid budget for schools. So we now have some additional information, and we want to incorporate that into our budget. So happy to report some additional revenues coming into the general fund. With that, though, some shifts in expenditures. So we do have some additional expenditures coming to the general fund. But in the end of the school year, I'm still projecting us to be within that 15 to 20% target that we're going for, recommended by the Michigan school business officials. I'm anticipating an ending fund balance this school year of just under $31.6 million, which represents a 17.7% fund balance.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Questions or comments from the board? The only thing I would say is, Mrs. Smith, we are so appreciative as a board that you bring amendments, that we do amendments regularly to our budget. I think it makes a huge difference. It keeps us aware of what's going on, keeps us aware of changing expenditures, changing revenues, and it allows us as a board to be cognizant and to do our job, and you make ours so much easier. So thank you to you and your staff for putting these amendments together.
Well, thank you. I'm always so appreciative, too. The board is always so engaged in those conversations and asks wonderful questions. So thank you for paying attention to this very important topic. And obviously, yeah, it's wonderful to be able to work hand in hand with the board when we share ideas with you and things that we think would make sense. And we appreciate getting the feedback from the board. So thank you for that partnership.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to approve the 2023-2024 budget amendment. May I have a motion? I'm sorry, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, the motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 6G, approval of resolution for summer tax collection. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Jarvis.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools approve the attached resolution to invoke for 2024 its previously adopted ongoing resolution imposing a summer tax levy of 50% of the annual property taxes upon property located within the district, and continuing from year to year until specifically revoked by the board, and requests that the cities of Livonia and Westland collect those summer taxes.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield. And once again, we'll hear from Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, President Johnson, and thank you to the board again for the discussion we were able to have on this topic at the study session and the committee of the whole. As you know, it's been our past practice to levy 50% of the school taxes in the summertime and 50% in the winter. We also had a wonderful discussion last week about the tax collection agreement with the city of Livonia. For those that didn't tune in, we are hoping to negotiate, and we have support from the City Council to negotiate a new agreement for the tax collection services. It's an agreement that was entered into in 1994, and we believe needs to be updated accordingly. So we appreciate being able to have discussions with the board and get direction from our board on how you'd like us to proceed with the City of Livonia. So we're very eager to bring updates to the board on how that progress is going. And we appreciate your support tonight in continuing our practice for the 50% levy in the summertime.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Questions, comments from there? Mrs. Burton?
Thank you to Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Oquist for doing a very considerable amount of work on the discussion, Mrs. Smith, that you alluded to on the tax collection fee. It has grown to be nearly $500,000, which is what we believe to be an exorbitant amount of money. But this is not something that can be discussed lightly. There is a necessity for a great deal of research, a great deal of discussion on the part of both the school district and the city. But some very, very deep digging has been done by both Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Oquist and your staff. And I would just like to thank you for doing that work so that we can have productive discussions with the city about getting a much more reasonable amount of money for this service.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Mrs. Frank?
Thank you. And just for clarity's purpose, if we approve this tonight and by some chance we're not able to reach an agreement in the negotiations, there's still a 60-day notification that we can change this, even though it's been approved tonight. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
This is more so for our taxpayers to indicate our desire to continue with a 50% levy. How those taxes are collected can still be worked out. So we, of course, will keep the board updated on what our plans are for the collection of these taxes.
Thank you. Mrs. Bonnefield?
Mrs. Smith, if we do not pass this resolution, then what is the impact on not passing this resolution?
For us, it would be a switch in our past practice, so this would move us towards 100% winter tax levy.
Okay.
And for us, that would prove challenging, I think, twofold. Number one, for those taxpayers, that are used to spreading their tax payment between the summer and the winter. That would be something new and different for them. And for us, on a cash flow basis, we start our school year off obviously in September, and the fiscal year actually starts July 1st. So we would be putting off collections of roughly about $12.5 million in our general fund until December. So we use those funds, and thankfully, because they come in, we have not had to do any cash flow borrowing for a number of years. I can say at least since 2016, we haven't had to borrow funds because we do this 50% levy in the summertime.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Johnson. I just wanted to make note, in the event someone may have been tuning in tonight just for the first time, the reason that we are looking to negotiate a more reasonable tax collection fee with the city of Livonia is because the amount that we're paying now, as Mrs. Burton indicated, is almost $500,000 a year. And the intent of the statute and the law relating to this at the state level is that any tax collection fee is meant to be an above and beyond cost incurred by the city on behalf of the school entity. And at this point in time, we are concerned that this amount far exceeds any above and beyond costs. And so folks that are listening may think that this is a fee for service or determined on a proportional amount based on what is collected for taxes. And that is not the intent, the spirit, or the language of the law. The language of the law is specific to those above and beyond costs.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Questions, comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, to approve the resolution for summer tax collection. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. That takes us now to item 7, our instruction matters. Item A is approval of expulsion of secondary student. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Burton.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District expel one secondary student for violations of the Livonia Public Schools Board of Education policies.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Frank. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
I would. Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. That takes us to item 8, personnel matters, and our item A is teachers for approval. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Frank.
I'm really close to making that motion. Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and offer employment for the 2023-24 school year to the teachers listed on the attached document.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Acosta. And you weren't forgotten, Mr. Abate.
Thank you very much, President Johnson. Good evening, everybody. So the new staff members we are presenting to the board this evening fill a range of needs, this time primarily in special education, although there's some secondary core instruction in there as well. They're all very well qualified to fill these positions and have been fully vetted through our interview process. We're confident they will perform at a high level and represent LPS in a manner that is consistent with our shared vision and collective commitments. These positions have also been included in the 2023-2024 budget. We're pleased to be recommending these talented professionals to join our LPS family. And with your approval, we're excited to have them working with our students.
Thank you, Mr. Abate. Questions or comments from the board? Yes, just welcome. All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Acosta, to approve the teachers on the list. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank.
Support? Yes.
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 8B, leaves of absence. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Mrs. Oakwest,
Yes.
can you give me the pronunciation?
Lefebvre.
Lefebvre, thank you. Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and approve the request for a leave of absence as listed below. Caitlin Lefebvre, and January 8, 2024.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, and again, Mr. Abate.
Yes, thank you. So the staff member listed in your documentation, as you've noted, is requesting a leave in accordance with their collective bargaining agreement, and we ask that you please approve the leave as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Abate. Any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to approve the leave of absence. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank? Yes. Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 8C, resignations. This does not require a motion. It is for board information only. That takes us to item 8D, retirements. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolutions of appreciation for services rendered by Ann Burlier, Mary Corp., Stephen Fryer, Winifred Wendy Kasmark, Nancy McNeil, Christina Palmerville.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Acosta, and we'll hear from Mrs. Keats.
Yes, good evening. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we honor and congratulate 6 members of our LPS family who are retiring from their positions with Livonia Public Schools. As these staff members leave the district, they take with them a combined total of 167 years of experience. On behalf of the administration, I would like to thank our retirees for their dedicated years of service they have provided the students and LPS. And we ask the board, please adopt the attached resolution of appreciation.
Thank you, Mrs. Keats. Questions or comments from the board?
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Yes. It's always hard to lose that much institutional knowledge. Unfortunately, it happens, and we deal with it, and we always seem to replace with qualified people. So that's a testament to not only our employees, but our administration, too. So thank you.
President Johnson? I'm sorry, may I ask for just a moment of privilege just to add something? Sorry to interrupt you.
Certainly.
I just wanted to add, because at a personal note, Ms. Ann Boilier, who is retiring, we go back to my very first day here as an assistant principal, and she kept me on the straight and narrow from that day forward. And so, Ann, I just want to tell you congratulations. I hope that you get all the rest and have all the enjoyment you deserve in the years ahead. And I just wanted to add that. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you, Mr. Abate. I'm just not quite sure you're on the straight and narrow.
She tried. She tried anyway.
But, yes. All right, any other questions or comments?
No.
Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Acosta, to accept the resolution of retirements. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That now takes us to item 9, hearing from board members. And item A is first reading of board policy, instructional programs, policy IHF. If Mr. Willenborg was here, he'd use the militaries, but I won't. Graduation requirements. And we'll hear from Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you, President Johnson. This policy hasn't been updated since 2015, and I'm going to walk you through some of the changes, but the main change is that we'd like to provide our students more opportunities in science, and this would begin with the class of 2025. So in the board policy, we've added some language that schedule assignments are necessary, may be approved by the principal. We added with the support of the director of secondary programs in section 1. The section 2, credit requirements, we just took out the word successfully earned, since students who earn their credit already have been successful. In section 3, credits earned prior to high school, we just changed the title of my department in the board policy. It's listed as Office of Instruction, and it is now called the Academic Services Department, but all the rest of the policy stands. The main change is under number 4, Common Learnings. This is where we have outlined that the credits that students earn in high school, and there is a language change in language arts. A few years ago, we went to English Language Arts 9, 10, 11, and 12 when we adopted StudySync. And so the change for Language Arts 11 and Language Arts 12 hasn't been represented in board policy yet, so that's just a language change. We've already changed the curriculum. In mathematics, we added a link to the choices for equivalency for Algebra 2. So that is a live link to board policy that takes you to another document of what other courses can be substituted for Algebra 2. In section C, science, that's where our main change is in this policy. Our previous policy listed 1 unit of biology, 1 unit of chemistry, and 1 unit of physical science, or completes a CTE program. Students are required to take 3 units of science. We would like to change it to 1 unit of biology, 1 unit of chemistry or physics, beginning with the class of 2025, and 1 unit of science or completion of a CTE program. This would allow students to take science programs and courses that align with their desires after high school, and opens up opportunities and choice for our students. Section D, social studies, stays the same. Physical education stays the same. Under F, visual, performing, and or applied arts, we just put the abbreviation there. World languages, we made the change of the completion of a career technical education program rather than completes. So we just changed the language there. On page 2, there's no change under 5. The change under online learning experience is the requirement will be met through online experiences provided in required high school core courses. Just moved the placement of the word required. 7, 8, 9 stand the same. In section 10, early graduation, we capitalized superintendent.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. Questions, comments from the board? Mrs. Bonifield?
Mrs. O'Brien, I'm happy, very happy to see that we've put some flexibility into our science, and that we're moving to more of the state standard where we had a higher requirement for physics and chemistry. It allows the kids to do, as you said, a lot more exploring. I know we had a lot of discussion about the graduation year that these apply to, and I believe that we've decided that in this version that many of the students during the graduation year that it qualifies for have already taken both the physics and chemistry, which might be a little bit disconcerting for some of the kids who feel like they may have wanted to take the one or the other and take another science. But can you just explain why, even though it seems retroactive, that we've included that, why we've made that change for the 2025 graduation year, even though many of those students have already taken both chemistry and physics?
Yes, I'm happy to. So we looked into at all 3 of our high schools and checked in with counselors how many students who are current juniors who would be in physics for whatever reason, may need a science next year as a senior. And there was more than a handful. And so we wanted to make sure that we offered them that opportunity to have choice. And so each one of the high schools had different numbers. The counselors will help students know the choices, will advertise them as a part of course selection, but then they can work with our current juniors when they're selecting their courses for next year, senior year, that there would be several, and when I mean several, I mean over 20 at every one of our schools, so we want to make sure they have that opportunity for choice next year.
Okay, and then should parents or students have questions about what may seem like a retroactive change, will they be prepared to make sure that they're able to discuss that with the students and the parents as to why we did that and how that there was kind of an overlap between some that did and didn't, and how that all works out?
Yes, Mr. Etu and I will work on a communication that will go out to all parents so that they're aware whether their student is going to be a senior next year or a junior next year. So they could be in 10th grade science right now, what their choices are for junior year, and our freshmen and all our incoming high schoolers beyond that. So we'll make sure that communication goes out to everyone, and then our counselors will help them make those decisions.
And one last item, sorry,
No.
is I know that during our discussions there was a little bit of concern with parents or that many of our students that are college bound may need to have chemistry and physics on their transcript, and there was some concern that if we made this change, that those college-bound students, it may change things for the college-bound students, which it doesn't, but just that they would then be directed by their counselor to meet their college requirements, just like social studies and math and English language, that they would then be directed to take both the physics and chemistry, even though for graduation purposes it's not required, but they would get the appropriate guidance to take both of those classes should it be a requirement for the colleges that they're moving toward.
It's still highly encouraged that they take all three, but this allows students to individualize that third year of science. Maybe they're going into a program where they want to have an AP course instead. So we want to make sure that we counsel our students, and our amazing counselors do a great job of preparing them for the pathway that they are moving towards. So this would still allow and encourage students to take all three of those courses, but then also offer that opportunity to do something different for that third year.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're
Sorry
welcome.
for all the questions.
That's what we're here for. Any other questions, comments?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Mrs. O'Brien, thank you very much. This has been, many of our policies go through pretty quickly. This has been one that has had a lot of discussion, a lot of questions and answers, and that's because we're all trying to make sure that we give as many options to our kids while making certain that they have what they need before they walk out our door. But thank you on behalf of myself and my colleagues for handling a lot of our questions on this one.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate the fact that you have made that, proposed this language so that this year's juniors and next year's seniors also, if they choose to, can take advantage of this option. 20 isn't a small number in a school, so that's a whole class worth of kids that may need to take something different in order to put themselves on a better track. So thank you very, very much. I know it's easier to push it out a couple years. So I appreciate the extra effort that you and science teachers and counselors have gone to already before this is even actually finalized. So we appreciate it. One other topic that was discussed at length was the testing out option, which has always been part of this policy.
Yes.
But just so folks are aware, it's certainly not a majority of our students, but there are students here and there that can benefit from a test out. One of them is regarding our foreign language we discussed. Students who grow up in a bilingual home may be able to test out of that immediately and therefore be able to take other classes from which they would benefit much more to a greater degree than they would an additional foreign language class that they've already mastered probably by the time they were 6.
Absolutely.
For those few folks out there who feel that they may benefit from a test out option in a foreign language or any of our courses, please see our counselors and find out what the policy, what the procedure is for that, what the timing is like, what the requirement is, and so forth. So-
We publish test out dates every year and put them on the website.
Okay, and that's on the website. Would it be on the website for each high school? And where would parents or students find that? Do we know?
On each high school website,
It's also on the district website.
under counseling.
Looks like Mrs. Jenkins is trying to say something behind.
We just updated one of the test outs. It's actually under the programs tab on the main district site.
Okay, so for those who may not have heard.
High school programs, and then test out is under that.
Okay, so from what Mrs. Jenkins just said, but she's not mic'd, on the main district website, it's under the programs tab?
Yes.
Okay, and then go to high school programs, and then go to test out, and you'll get information, or you can contact your student's counseling
And it's
office.
also on each high school.
Okay, all right. Again, thank you very much. This is no small undertaking, and it's very appreciated.
My pleasure.
President Johnson?
Mrs. Frank?
On those test outs, do each individual date of availability, right, there's so many different, are they all updated February 1st of when the test outs are? Because I know each class has its own test out. Is there a date that they are all live on the website?
So the coordinators work with the schools, so our math science coordinator offers mathematics test outs. Mrs. Rousseau offers ELA. So we offer them and we make sure that that list is out there. We don't necessarily have a date for every course, but a parent can always request a test out. But we have, a group of courses that students test out of every single year, like the example of personal fitness is one, world languages is one, sometimes a math course or an ELA course.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Any other questions or comments? Are we satisfied now with this language?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, then we will put this on for a second reading in our January regular meeting. Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. All right, we are at the end, and as usual, I will open it up to my colleagues. Anyone who wants to say anything this evening? No. Mrs. Acosta, thank you.
Thank you. Just so that we have something to be said, but I just wanted to give a shout out to our PTSA Council and our robotics program for their LPS Family Engineering Night. It was really great to see the kiddos building structures out of noodles and just these great engineering activities that they got to engage in. So thank you for doing that for our families.
Thank you, Mrs. Acosta. Anyone else? I just want to thank our cabinet, our administration, the staff, and all employees of LPS that do everything every day for our students to make this district, in my opinion, the best in the state. And we appreciate it from this table. So thank you to all of those folks. And I will just say Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to everyone. Please be safe over the holidays, and we will be back. I think our first study session is like the 16th of January. So with that, if there's no more business to be brought before the board tonight, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Good night.